Hey guys, how you doing? Joe here from the Scruffy Fam. Hey, I'm really excited for this week's video. This week what we're going to do is we're going to take you through how we do compost. It's kind of a compost 101. In the beginning of the video I'm going to go through for you guys how we now do our compost. And near the end of the video, Tasha's going to go into great detail of all the intricacies of compost, how it works, what you need for it, and different things that you can do to get it going so you can get your own compost gold. Alright guys, I'm getting set up here. What we're going to do is we're going to clean out the chicken coop, and we're going to take all of their bedding and we're going to put it right into our compost. I've got a bucket set up over here to kind of scrape it in, make my life a little bit easier. And then also inside their run, we're going to take the run down about 2 inches, and all of that's going to go right into our compost pile. And I'll show you guys why that's so awesome. Right now our compost is about 95 degrees. We have a steady pile right now, but once I add all of this chicken waste to the top of it, you guys will see it's going to go crazy. So come along with me. Alright guys, so I've got the chicken coop cleaned out. During the winter we're going to do a deep litter method, but for now we're just doing a really light one. It's hard to tell from this angle, but they've only got about an inch and a half of pine in there once they scratch it around. So we got their nest box set up. And then inside their run I took it down about 2 inches. And I don't have any grass right now that's ready to go in there, so we're going to put some straw in there just to give them something to scratch around into the dirt. It also helps with the smell. These hot summer days make that chicken poop stink, especially because they're eating all the mulberries off of our mulberry tree that are falling. They're getting those. So, but let's check out our compost pile. I haven't watered this yet. We're gonna do that next. But as you can see, I'm now just a couple inches from the top after we put in all of that stuff. And if you look at our temperature, we're still holding the same, okay? But I'm gonna go ahead and water it, and after I water it, we'll check it out one more time. All right guys, let's go check this out. I just watered it, as you guys saw. So let's go look and see where we're at. Sorry, there we go. So we'll check back in an hour or two and see how we're doing. 24 hours after we put the chicken scraps in here, the chicken waste, we are at a active pile. So we were steady before, now we're back up to active. This is only 24 hours. So in 24 hours, we're almost at 120 degrees. And we'll check it tomorrow and show you guys what it looks like when you do 48 hours. All right guys, so it's been 48 hours since we cleaned out the chicken coop and added all of that waste to our compost pile. So 48 hours, and you can see we are now at about 125 degrees. So in 48 hours, we have gone up about 30 degrees in our compost pile just by adding all that chicken waste. All right guys, so this is our quick pile that we showed you about cleaning out the chicken coop and getting that going. We also have a slow pile, so let's take you guys back to the slow pile. And then here is our slow pile. Now when we moved in, this pile was already here. Well, the bin was already here. We've added to this pile since then. And you can see down here at the bottom, some of that is already well on its way. This is where we put a lot of the big stuff that's going to take a long time. And if I need to backfill with browns into our quick pile, I come back here, grab stuff, break it down, and it goes.
Hey guys, thought I would hop in here real quick and talk about how you can build a compost pile if you don't have any chickens. Now, we did have a compost pile last year and we just got our chickens this spring. So we do have some experience doing this without, and it definitely takes a little bit longer, we found. but you can still get some really great compost out of it. So for your basic compost pile, you only need 3 things. You need air, water, and food. And food can be a little bit tricky. I'll break that down in a minute. But air is pretty simple. At the bottom of our pile, we put a whole bunch of sticks. Some bigger sticks. Now we know that those aren't going to really break down into dirt, but they do help with airflow. Another thing that you are meant to do is ideally you would turn the pile about once a week. We don't always get out here quite that often, but the really nice thing about our geobin is that with the holes all throughout it, it gets pretty decent airflow. There's definitely some times when we still need to turn it. And how we do that, and the next time we do this, I'll make sure that we record it. We lay out a tarp next to it, and then unwrap the whole thing, basically knock it over onto the tarp, kind of stir it around. If we need to add any greens or browns at that time, we do. And then we put the geobin back together, shovel everything back in, and that's how we do it. It's pretty simple, it doesn't take super long. So the second thing, water. You want to make sure that it's damp like a moist sponge. Now if you get a thunderstorm and torrential downpour, it is what it is. But anytime you add new materials, you want to make sure that you wet the whole pile down until it's kind of like a moist sponge. Not enough water, if everything dries out, will slow down the microorganism activity that's actually breaking down your pile. Too much water and there's not enough oxygen, which the microorganisms also need. So it's a balance of air and water. Now, when we get to food, when you go and do some research on composting, most commonly you're going to see lists of greens and lists of browns. So the way this works is the browns are carbon, so anything that's dried out. Could be cardboard, could be shredded paper if you're kind of in a pinch. Dry leaves are kind of like the gold standard. You can use wood chips, but you want to make sure that you kind of know where they're from. A, that they weren't treated with any chemicals, and B, that they're not black walnut. Black walnut naturally has a component that will actually inhibit plant growth. So if that ends up in your compost in your garden, obviously that's a problem. And I'm not going to go through the full list of everything that would be a green or a brown. That's pretty easy to Google or look on Pinterest, or there's a bunch of YouTube videos out there going into that piece of it more in depth. And the greens are nitrogen, so anything that's still living. That would be fresh grass clippings. In our case, we use our chicken manure as a green. Anytime you pull weeds, anytime you prune anything, that all can go right in the compost pile. Veggie scraps from our kitchen go in the compost pile as a green also. Now, the ratio here is the important part. So usually there's different ranges that you'll find online, but you want to make sure that you have more browns than green. If you have too many greens, your pile will start to rot and then it starts to stink, and that's not great. So you really just need enough greens, and I like to think of the greens as like giving the microorganisms some energy so that they can break down the browns. So the browns is going to be their primary source of food. That is what turns into the dirt. And another important thing to remember is that anything that you're going to add to your compost pile, you want to make sure you have it fairly broken down into small pieces first. So if you do take a pruning of, like a hydrangea or something, and you have this really big stick, it's a good idea to cut that down into smaller chunks. The smaller the pieces, the faster they'll break down. So one thing that you want to make sure you do not add to your compost pile is anything with meat, fat, dairy, anything like that. It would take too long to break down, and the chances are that it would rot and start to attract unfriendly critters is too high. It's not something that's just going to naturally just kind of break down over time like something carbon or nitrogen based will. Also, you want to make sure that you're not adding anything that's made of plastic, because obviously that's not just going to break down, it's going to still be in your compost. If you get little bits and pieces that fall in, it's not going to be the end of the world, but like if you are using shredded paper, which we have used as kind of like a fill-in when we're slightly low on browns, you want to make sure you don't include any envelope windows, like those plasticky windows, no credit card pieces, any of that kind of stuff. the pile gets really hot and you don't want any chemicals to be leached out of the plastic into your pile. So you want to avoid that as much as you possibly can. You also want to make sure that any of the plant material that you're putting in has not been sprayed with any chemicals. No pesticides, no herbicides, because all of those are going to end up in your final compost and therefore in your garden. And then the third thing, which is mostly a consideration for us, is you want to make sure that any leaves that you're using have not been contaminated with any dog or cat waste, mostly dog. Urine isn't necessarily such a consideration. If there's just some urine, it would probably be fine, but especially you want to make sure there's no dog poop. Dog poop is not considered a cold manure, but it also can have a lot of bacteria and stuff that's really not good for your soil. You can technically compost it, but you need to make sure you have a really, really hot pile and that stuff is right in the middle. So if it's just kind of mixed in with your browns that you throw on top, that's not going to be good. You're going to contaminate your entire compost pile, and then you're not going to have a good final product for your plants. So as far as what you can compost in, like I mentioned, we have this, which is called a Geo Bin. It's a brand name. We just got it on Amazon. It was like $20. The thermometer that we have in it, I think, was like $12, so it really doesn't cost very much. There are a lot of other options if you have a smaller yard, or even if you're in an apartment complex. On your back porch, they have a million different kinds of tumblers that you could look at doing. And those can be really handy because if there is any smell, then it contains it. It keeps out any critters, and it's really easy to turn. You just basically go out and and crank the wheel, and then that turns your compost pile. It can be really handy, but they also tend to cost more, so that's something that you have to kind of balance out. Other options that you'll see out there is people, especially if they have larger property, will set up, you can build a wood structure, and that's actually what our slow compost pile is. A lot of times you'll see like homesteads and farms with like compost bays where there's like 2 or 3 of them, and you can make those really cheaply and easily out of 3 pallets that you find, as long as they're not treated. And then you basically just make like 3 stalls, and the idea behind that is then you can turn from one to the next one and then start a new pile over here while this one's finishing, and it gives you a lot more flexibility. But it does take up more space, it's more open, and it's more of a permanent structure. So if you're going to set it up somewhere, you want to make sure that you're going to be there for a little while. One other really neat composting method that I've seen is actually trenches. So if people are going to be growing an in-ground garden, what I've seen them do is they'll actually dig up some of the dirt and throw in all of their like greens, kitchen scraps, all the stuff that you would put in a normal compost pile into the trench, and then bury it with the dirt on top. Now the idea is if you leave that for like a season, come back later, you can plant directly into that soil, and those roots are going to go down into the compost, and they have all those nutrients right there. It's super easy. It cuts down on the smell, it cuts down on the mess. You don't have to turn it, and you don't have to worry about any like critters, although I suppose groundhogs and moles could probably still get in there, but it's not like you don't have to worry about any raccoons coming and making a mess of your compost pile. And then of course there's the old-fashioned, you could just throw everything into a pile on the ground. That's not usually the preferred method because you really kind of need the mass to be able to warm up the pile enough to quickly break things down. If you just kind of like threw a pile together, it could definitely work as a slow pile. I've also seen M.I. Gardner did a video where he threw everything together, threw a tarp over it, and then overwintered it that way, because actually the snow kind of helped insulate some of that heat in. But when I say mass, that's the reason that we like the Geo Bin. That's the reason why the tumblers work, because it keeps all of the material tightly compact together. Ideally, like a 3x3x3 pile is what's going to help heat up the center the most. Now, like I said, you don't have to. If you just have a bunch of You know, like if you just go and clear out some forest land and have a bunch of sticks and stuff, you could just toss it in a pile. Eventually it would break down. Just kind of depends on how quickly you need usable compost and how much. After your compost has sat for a while, probably turn it a few times. You can check and see if any of it is done. Now, especially with our pile here cooking at 120 degrees, it won't take very long for us to at least have some usable compost out of this. So what you do when it's done, and how we know it's done, is when the temperature goes back down. Right now it's cooking, and then when it goes down, that kind of tells us that the bacteria have done their thing. And if we wanted to leave it, then we could. Most likely what would happen is we'd get a bunch of worms that came in, and then it would be like a vermicompost, which is never a bad thing. Just depends on how quickly we need it. So this is actually some compost that we did in our last batch. And so what you do is we have a screen that's made out of 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch hardware cloth. And then we just put it over one of those really wide Rubbermaid buckets. And so then you just basically shovel from the pile onto the screen, kind of spread it around. Anything that's a smaller piece will fall through. And then anything that stays on top, obviously it's either a bigger stick for airflow or hasn't quite broken down all the way back in the compost pile. So this is an example of some of our compost here. Now this is pretty broken down. We do have some larger sticks and that kind of thing. These I'm not worried about. If I'm planting like seeds and I really want to have a nice loose soil for them to grow through, I'll just pull some of these sticks out. If I am just throwing this like on top as kind of like a fertilizer to be watered into the plant once it's established, then these little pieces are perfectly fine. I'm not worried. It's basically just mulch. Okay, so some problems that you can run into with your compost pile. One would be if it is too slow. Now usually this happens if your pieces are too big or if you don't have enough nitrogen. Like I said, if it's all, once the temperature drops, if it's all browns in there, then the organisms don't really have anything to give them the energy in order to break those down, and so it's just gonna kind of sit. Now worms will help with that, like I was talking about. However, what you can do is turn your pile, add some water, and that's pretty much any compost problem starts with turn your pile, maybe add water. So in the case of it not breaking down, definitely turn, get some airflow in there, water it to make sure that everything is nice and moist for the bacteria. And then I would add some greens. So if you want to kind of like boost your compost pile really quickly, if you have chickens, obviously that's a great idea. Or you can actually add something like coffee grounds, have a lot of nitrogen in them, and they will give that quick burst of energy to the microorganisms in your pile to help kind of start breaking that down really quickly. The second problem that you could run into is if the pile is too wet or has too many greens. Now we actually did run into this after we added our chicken waste. It smelled kind of sour and just wasn't really seeming right. And so again, like I said before, number one is turn it, add more airflow. That'll help to kind of dry it out also. And then number two, in this case, if it's too wet, obviously don't add more water because that'll just make the problem worse. But what you can do is when you're turning it, mix in some of those dry browns. So if you have leaves, great. If you just mowed your lawn, fresh cut grass is green. However, if you kind of spread it out on a tarp and leave it in the sun for a few hours to a day or two, and it dries, then it's a giant pile of browns. So that's something that you could mix in there. You could also do straw, wood chips, any like pine shavings, like we have chicken coop, would work great. Any of that kind of stuff would help to kind of really balance out and bring the green level down so that it's not just overproducing bacteria that are just kind of sitting there and essentially fermenting. It doesn't smell great. And then the third problem that you can run into is if you're getting a bunch of vermin digging around and making a mess of your compost pile. Usually this happens if you threw out kitchen scraps on top, or if you mixed in something that had some fat or some meat or something, and then the smell attracted them. So whenever you're adding kitchen scraps, you always want to make sure that you kind of dig out a little bit of a hole, put the kitchen scraps in, and then cover it over. It'll still break down just fine, and that will actually get it closer to the center where it's the warmest so that it can break down quickly, but then it doesn't get a chance to attract any critters. Now you can tell we have an urban homestead, so we are in the middle of urban wildlife. We get raccoons, I'm pretty sure we have a few chipmunk families living around here because they love to dig in my garden, as well as a bunch of other critters, and we've never had anyone come and attack our compost pile. So as long as you make sure that any of that kind of stuff is nice and buried, you'll be fine. Alright guys, so that is it as far as composting basics. If you have any questions, make sure you put them down in the comments, and hit us up on social media. Make sure you follow the video and all that stuff, and we will catch you guys in the next one. Bye!